If you compare the life of a peasant in the year 1400 to the life of a peasant in the year 1066, their lives would be practically the same. Very little had changed. And if you compared the life of somebody working in the countryside in 1700, their lives would probably be very similar to the life of a peasant working in 1400. So over centuries of English history, for most people in the country, very little changed. However, if you took the life of a normal person in Britain at the time of 1700 and you compared it to the life of ordinary people 200 years later in 1900, people's lives had transformed. People's lives had revolutionized. In 1700, 80% of people lived and worked in the countryside in rural areas. 200 years later, 80% of people now lived and worked in towns and cities, in urban areas, and they often worked in the new factories that had cropped up over the 200-year period. In 1700, few things were actually made, but when they were made by hand, and they often made in people's cottages. But 200 years later, in 1900, huge amounts of things were being made, and they're often manufactured by machines in factories in the cities. In 1700, if you wanted to get anywhere, you would have to go by horse and cart, or if you could afford a stagecoach, and it took days to get anywhere at all because of the muddy, boggy roads you had to cross. But 200 years later, you could travel in a matter of hours to many places in the country on the new railways that crisscrossed the country. So transport had revolutionised too. In 1700, there were only about 6 million people living in England, but 200 years later, the population had exploded to 30 million. So this was a period of a huge amount of change. It was a revolution in how people lived. And this revolution was fueled by factories where things were made. So this period of history, this period of change is called the Industrial Revolution. Industry is when things are made. Revolution is a big change in how things are made. And this Industrial Revolution started in Britain. Britain was the first country in the world to go through this period of industrial revolution, and because of this, it helped Britain spread and cement its empire. So by the end of the 19th century, Britain had a vast empire, which helped it become the most powerful nation in the world. Britain ruled over 1/5 of the land mass of the world, and actually a quarter of the world's population accepted Queen Victoria as their monarch. So the key question is why did this Industrial Revolution happen? Why did it happen first in Britain, and why did it happen in the 17 and 1800s? Well, there are several main reasons for this. The first reason is the geography of the United Kingdom. If you look at this map, you can see that England is crisscrossed with rivers, which not only help with trade, but also most of these rivers are very fast-flowing rivers, so they can power the water wheels that were needed to power the machinery in the new factories that needed to be built. You can also see on this map, the areas shaded in green, the huge deposits of coal that were available in Britain at the time. So these coal seams deep under the earth, if you mined out, but the coal provided the fuel to power the machines and the steam trains and the machine which led to the Industrial Revolution. Also, with Britain being very close to Europe, close to the continent, meant that it had very easy access to trade with Europe. So when Britain made things in the Industrial Revolution, they had markets to sell those things to, and also the expanding British Empire as well meant that Britain had many markets to sell their goods to. So the geography of Britain was one of the factors which triggered this Industrial Revolution. The second reason was the agricultural revolution that had been going on in Britain in the 1700s. So many farmers had realised that you could make more money, more profit, if instead of having lots of different peasant farmers growing different things in individual strips of land, that actually if you had one big field where you grew just one type of crop. So this led to lots of peasants' fields being enclosed, so a fence built around it, so that it was just one big field that grew just one crop, and this increased yields. It meant that more food could be grown. Of course, lots of hardship for the peasants dispossessed their land, but yields improved. It also, many farmers realised that actually if you did selective breeding with animals, so if you got the biggest, fattest bull and you made it breed with the biggest, fattest cow, you would get big, fat calves. And so selective breeding meant that meat and dairy outputs increased as well. And new ways of farming were developed. Famously, a chap called Turnip Townsend realised that you didn't have to leave some of the land fallow, so not grow anything for it for some of the year so it can refresh, that actually you could put crops in like turnips, which actually improved the quality of the soil whilst giving food which people could eat and animals could eat as well. So not only was land being used more intelligently, the new breeding methods created more meat, and new farming methods meant more to be produced. So this meant that there was a surplus of food being grown. And it also meant that lots of people who were working in agriculture just weren't needed because the more efficient processes that used, which meant that you had lots of manpower available to go and work in towns, in factories, and it also meant you had lots of surplus food in the countryside, which could be then sold in towns to feed the population that were needed to work in the factories. Third reason were many of the new inventions that were happening at the time. So these were individuals who, through their own genius, if you like, or through their own hard work and engineering prowess, developed lots of new machines which could only really be used in a factory. So, for example, James Hargreaves invented a machine called the spinning jenny. So previously, people would spin thread to make cloth on spinning wheels in cottages, but James Hargreaves' spinning jenny did this about 9 or 10 times quicker. And then Arkwright invented a water frame, which was basically you could spin the thread, but using a water wheel to power the machine, which made it much more efficient and made better quality thread. And in other industries as well, there were different inventions. Newcomen developed a steam engine that could pump water out of mines to stop flooding. But then this steam engine that he produced was taken by James Watt and adapted through a series of cogs, so you could attach it to a wheel and then power a wheel to power machines and to power steam engines, which revolutionised a lot of the machinery that could be used. There was Richard Trevithick, who developed the first train to be used to carry coal out of mines. But then Stephenson's rocket famously was one of the first passenger trains that was used, and that's just a handful of examples of inventors and machines that were being invented in the 1700s and 1800s. And so without this machinery, without these inventions, then these factories and transport systems wouldn't have come into operation. But it took a certain type of person to use these inventions, to build the factories, to create the trade networks that were needed. And so the fourth reason for the Industrial Revolution was the fact that in Britain at the time there was a very entrepreneurial middle class. These were from families that hadn't inherited their wealth, that actually their wealth had come from trade. And they were seeking new ways to make more money. An example of this is a chap called Samuel Gregg, who who was looking at ways to improve his father's cloth trade, and he realised that actually if he took some of the new inventions in making cloth, and he put them in one place next to a fast-flowing river which could power the machinery, that would be a fast and efficient way of producing cotton cloth. And he realised that cotton cloth was a good trade to be in, because at the time cotton was cheap, because it was being grown by slaves in American colonies. And that because the British Empire was growing, because the population of Britain was growing, lots of people need clothes, and more people needed more clothes. And because people were earning more money because they were getting jobs in factories like Samuel Gregg's, they could afford more clothes as well. So cotton was a thriving industry to be in. And Samuel Gregg realised this. So he built a factory at a place called, in Style, a place called Quarry Bank Mill, up north. And he put these machines in a building, and people came and worked for him. Some people have argued that religion was a factor here as well, because Samuel Gregg and people in the middle class like him were quite often Protestant, but they were non-conformists, so they didn't really agree with the Church of England. They were more Puritan. And this meant that they were used to thinking about new ways of doing things, that they wanted to look after their workers. And some historians have argued that actually they because they're quite often out on a limb and had to build their own churches and to find their own ways of worshipping, that actually that they have more of a work ethic and worked harder. Some historians contest this, but many of these new mill owners who built these new mills were from non-conformist backgrounds. For example, the Cadbury family, who are famously Quakers, who built the chocolate factory in Birmingham. So these four reasons seem to come together: the fact that the UK was rich with natural resources, the fact that there were that the agricultural revolution had happened and that there was a surplus of food, that there were new inventions coming online, and you had these very wise businessmen who brought all these factors together to begin to build more and more factories, which more and more people came to work in. And so that meant that where mills appeared, like Quarry Bank Mill here that Samuel Gregg had built, that people would come to work there, that they needed to walk to work, and so towns would just spring up around these factories. So almost overnight, in the late 1700s and 1800s, towns like Manchester and Burnley just appeared. Where there had been nothing were suddenly these huge centres of population, and the Industrial Revolution had begun. And this Industrial Revolution transformed people's working lives. It transformed the environment in which they lived. And there's still quite a lot of debate of whether actually this transformation from a mainly rural life to a mainly urban life was a good thing for Britain and the rest of the world, or actually due to global warming and pollution, that it might have been the start of our demise.